Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We're aware that many of you are dialing in from different geographies, time zones, and/or maybe watching this recording offline or after the fact. Thank you all so much for joining us today for the session on our Supply Chain ESG Risk Outlook 2024. I've had a sneak preview of the slides, and you're definitely in for something special. Thank you also to Ding Ding for allowing me to be your partner in this discussion. I've learned so much from you already during this process, and I know that our audience is going to find this super compelling. Before we get started, I'm going to just quickly take us through a quick snapshot of our agenda and the flow of the session today, as we really learn a lot more about the dynamic landscape of supply chains and really why companies need to be increasingly agile in their management of risks and assurance than really ever before. We're going to split this session into 4 parts. I am going to take us briefly through the context and methodology. I will then hand over to Ding Ding, who's going to talk us through the supply chain ESG risk outlook for 2024, which is the exciting part that you are waiting for. After that, we will touch briefly on transparency, traceability, and confidence at a high level, and really just triple underline the imperative for assurance really in this kind of digital age in the what's next section. As we kind of go through this narrative, you'll see that we allude to a lot of the concepts that we've referenced in Assurance 4.0, continuous assurance, the idea of being dynamic, fast-moving, agile, hyper-responsive. If you haven't yet heard about Assurance 4.0, please do go to our website, lrqa.com, and look in the News and Insights section. Just a quick update on your 2 hosts for today. My name is Kevin Franklin. I'm the Chief Growth Officer at LRQA. I've been with the company for coming up on 8 years in August, and I'm joined by Ding Ding, who many of you will know and love, who is our Senior Director of Product and Analytics with a particular focus on EIQ, country, geographic, product risk, and also the design of so many of our supply chain ESG tools. Ding Ding trumps me again and has been with LRQA now for coming up on 12 years. So let's just talk briefly about this first section, the context and methodology part of our conversation. Really what we're going to focus on in this part is kind of a little bit of background in terms of the drivers for business, the drivers for us as an organization supporting our clients, and also a little bit of what feeds this cycle of ever deeper business transformation in the context of ESG. We think most of you will already know and understand the need for supply chain ESG due diligence. The kind of central takeaway here of due diligence as being critical yet challenging should not be a surprise. Likewise, it shouldn't be a surprise for anyone here to be rethinking what your responsible sourcing program looks like for the next decade. Why shouldn't it be a surprise? Because actually, the things on the right are things you all know and are facing on a day-to-day basis. We're not doing a deep dive here on new regulations, but you'll see a lot of content on that on our website, speaking to our consulting team. I think we all know that every day there are new regulations relating to aspects of ESG that impact supply chains, that impact business at the central core level, whether it's environmental, social, or actually from a governance perspective. And this is global and also then in specific geographies, stock exchanges and markets. So the regulatory regime around ESG has definitely increased and becoming increasingly challenging, I think, for companies to navigate. In addition, we are also very conscious more and more, particularly with generative AI, that there's increasingly an ability to get access to information using artificial intelligence or grievance mechanisms or online data sets, and that data itself, as a result, is becoming increasingly prized, and also something that we know companies are not just needing to use to make better business decisions, but also are increasingly concerned about and want to manage more effectively. With this and both the regulatory data and AI perspectives, we know and understand that there are some key issues in the supply chain ESG space that are still front and center, whether it's carbon, climate, energy, labor standards. They absolutely remain a core part of any responsible sourcing program. Likewise, we've seen some newer, more emergent topics like traceability, life cycle assessment, and we will touch on some of those during the course of this session, particularly in the latter sections. We also know that as the geopolitical and economic contexts evolve and unfold, the need for increasingly resilient and diversified supply chains is a central part of typically most day-to-day business narratives. So for companies, you need to balance all of these things, which is exactly why due diligence is really more critical and challenging than ever before, and why actually what your program looks like is something that you need to be taking active control of. Now, what we also know and understand, because we speak about due diligence now for almost 10 years, is that the process of due diligence, whether it's coming originally from the UN Guiding Principles on Business or Human Rights, or even actually some of the management systems infrastructure, the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle of ISO 9000, 14000, it looks largely like this. And much of this is kind of unchanged. The idea of diagnostic and upfront risk assessment, followed by program design, leading to training, on-the-ground monitoring, which can take the form of a range of different tools, whether it's audit, self-assessment questionnaires, worker surveys, spot check tools, CAP management, going on to remediation, deep investigations and driving significant change into factories, facilitating that root cause analysis and continued sustained learning and insight at the supplier level, all the way through to data collection, aggregation, benchmarking, reporting, disclosure, predictive management, continuous improvement. This whole cycle of due diligence is not new. What is new, however, are some of the tools that sit within that, whether they're data-driven or whether they are technology-informed, such as what we look at from an inherent risk perspective that Ding Ding will focus on, or tools like grievance mechanisms, worker surveys, self-assessment questionnaires, or Sentinel as an adverse media scanning tool that is really critical as part of informing your inherent risk landscape. So all of these tools that kind of you've known, seen, and become increasingly conscious of are tools that connect together. And what we've seen in doing this for many, many years is the need for an ever connected conversation around what happens to the data that comes from all of this due diligence experience. As you're going through that risk assessment, program design, segmentation, on the ground transformation, we've made a very conscious effort over the last 5 to 7 years in particular to build our suite of tools around the online EIQ platform such that we can collect, collate, integrate, analyze, and then use all of that data in a really rich format to inform better day-to-day decisions for business. And it's those decisions that we'll be discussing during this conversation. Not just the decisions, but also the data we've abstracted from that process, which has informed our geographic and product risk scores. Today, we've leveraged all of the underlying data from those different activities, collected it, integrated it, and then analyzed it from our data lake, covering now way over 100 plus geographies, looking at over 38 different issues, with probably around 7 years of data with a biannual refresh. Now, I'm not going to go into the detail. You can see some of the thematic areas: labor, health and safety, environment, business ethics, management systems, and all of the underlying component parts. We could have really focused this discussion on any one of those areas. Every area is relevant and compelling, and every area sees risks depending on the countries in questions. But today, we're really going to zoom in to 5 or 6 key topics that are very much front and center for business on a day-to-day basis. And these 5 or 6 key topics, I think, are the topics that increasingly inform that need for agility and rigor in how one builds and designs a responsible sourcing program, but also more and more informs the need for you as a leader in the responsible sourcing space to be increasingly agile yourself and proactive in how you engage and work with your internal stakeholders to ensure that you have the buy-in to respond to issues as and when they come up in your supply chains, because they will. Now, with that having been said, I'll pass over to Ding Ding, who will navigate us through this changing global risks landscape and the outlook for 2024.
Thank you, Kevin. Hi, everyone. This is Ding Ding. Very happy to be here to share with you our updated thinking on the 2024 risk outlook. Happy to be here every year. This is kind of my milestone, personal milestone. Good news is this year we have more countries. We expand the coverage of our geography risk ratings to a total of 113 countries and regions around the world. We witness a rise in the number of countries or geographies rated as high or extreme risk. Nearly half of them fall into this category. During today's sharing, we're going to focus on top 10 sourcing countries based on our audit data and go through the key topics as Kevin laid out. If we can go to the next slide. Firstly, child labor and forced labor. Both make their appearance to our media headlines on a regular basis. Investigative journalists continue to surface new insight from a world impacted by many things, from war to migration, inflation, technology, and political change. Even for someone like us who have been with the industry for over a decade, we are still regularly shocked by some of those news articles. For instance, most recent one, the female workers on the sugarcane farm in India, how they have been treated to make their work more efficient, is really disturbing. And we have seen that in other parts of the world, Mauritius, US, Indonesia, China, and more. The good news is we also see more issues being identified through audits. So, what we see from the audits is showing a similar trend as what we have seen on the media. If you go to the next slide, we will see the global risk landscape focusing on forced labor. In 2023, over 440 sourcing countries have been identified with forced labor-related issues. And one of the key drivers, of course, is related to foreign migrant workers. So workers migrate to a different country to seek for job opportunities, and they're subject to potential abuses. Indicators like excessive recruitment fees, retention of their identity documents, restriction of movement, illegal termination, punishment, etc. But they are not the only stories. There are also challenges in countries where, foreign migrant workers are less prominent. Countries like China, India, where lots of domestic migrant workers are being used. And they're also facing similar challenges, such as retention of their ID. We see issues of this particular issue in over 20 countries. So dispatched workers in China have to hand over their ID every day so that they will not leave the workplace. Or, security guards in Vietnam, Pakistan, and similar countries also need to do that for security purpose. So even though, this is not a new topic, but we are seeing more of those issues being serviced through audits.
It's fascinating, Ding Ding, particularly looking at the top 10 increased risk countries. How many of these are actually in Europe, for example, or even Australia, typically thought of as lower risk markets, but definitely showing strains, if you like, of, I think, just day-to-day economic pressures. And obviously, this leads to leading indicators of forced labor and increasingly actual incidents.
Absolutely. For instance, we see violations in Netherlands and UK related to foreign migrant workers, not only in factories, but also on a farm where, their ID have to be retained or passport have been retained by the employer, or they paid recruitment fees as part of the hiring process to a labor agent who then pass them onto the factory. So those are all violations we have seen from audits.
And then obviously there's some of those, let's say, countries that are top 10 sourcing countries that have historically been high risk and are, I think, getting even worse, such as Cambodia.
Absolutely. Let's talk about Cambodia specifically. Cambodia is a key sourcing country for apparel. It's actually the second largest after Vietnam in Southeast Asia. It's one of the biggest sector that provides foreign currency for the country. And we have seen audits that identify issues related to, restricting workers for accessing toilets, which is a very common thing that we see in many countries, not just in Cambodia, but in Malaysia, in Vietnam, and others, China, for instance. And we also have seen reports about the use of prison labor to make apparel products for some of the major brands. This is something came up last year. And one thing to highlight here, forced labor is also not just related to supply chain. It can be linked to many other topics, such as cyber. Cambodia is one of the countries where cyber scam operations have been found. We have seen news about workers from China, Vietnam, India, and other countries being trafficked to Cambodia and forced to participate in a cyber scam operation, and they were forced to work under impossible quota arrangements. And we've seen similar stories being discovered. Also forced labor, not just supply chain factories, but wider value chain. Let's take another example, Philippines, another country in Asia, high risk for climate change. They're very vulnerable in the time of when it comes to climate change. It's also a key country, or one of the largest country for sending country. So they send a lot of workers to other countries for employment opportunities. According to the government, more than 2 million Filipino people have migrated to over 100 countries in the last 30 or 40 years or so. And this makes about 10% of the GDP based on the remittances they transfer back to the Philippines. Philippines is also a key country for coconuts, mangoes, bananas, and pineapples. All of them have been flagged by the US Department of Labor for child labor risk. They are also high risk for forced labor. They go to other countries and they need to pay recruitment fees. For instance, in average, Filipino workers may pay up to $1,600 per person to work in a Taiwanese factory, which is one of the common destination for Filipino workers, along with others such as Japan and UK, UAE, etc.
Also a group that is very vulnerable to cyber scams relating to potential jobs. Definitely something we need to look at with our colleagues in the cyber division, perhaps for another session together.
Yes. Awesome. So yeah, if we zoom out, we look at forced labor. Let's take a look at the child labor risk landscape. We can see a similar trend. We see more issues being discovered through audits in comparison with previous years. So you can see the graph at the bottom left, even though it still represents a small percentage, but we see an increasing number of incidents being discovered through audits that are related to child labor. To give you a specific number, in 2023, we've seen child labor-related violations in over 40 countries and regions. And this still a small percentage, but it is increasing. And key sourcing countries, as you can see on the table on the top, key sourcing countries are either high or extreme risk for child labor, except for Italy. And we have seen many reports on the internet as well in 2023 uncovered through Sentinel. So for instance, the child laborers in the US, child laborers in China, we see a government penalty about child labor being used in printing and packaging facility. Similarly, similar trends is also observed in terms of harassment and abuse.
Oh, just before you go to that, maybe I can ask a question. So the percentage of audits with child labor, this is very interesting. Is this purely linked to, I guess, based on your expert judgment, what you feel are more child labor incidents, or has anything happened to the number of audits or to the design of audit tools that's improve their ability to detect child labor. I mean, we do quite a lot of audits a year, probably 25 to 30,000 on the social compliance side.
Mm.
And we've obviously got our own tools here, but has anything improved in the tool, or is this largely just due in your mind to really a heightened risk landscape?
I think it's a mix of a number of things. One is we do more audits in upstream supply chain.
Mm,
So previously we may focused more on the tier one suppliers, finished goods products. But in the in the recent years, we have expanded that scope to more upstream suppliers, tier two and potentially tier three. And also we do more audits in agriculture where, child labor is a high risk. So I think that's one of the reasons why we see more audits with child labor.
mm,
I also see that, because of the attention being, oh, by the way, other sectors in addition to agriculture, like other sectors like logistics, service sectors, we are also
yeah.
seeing more out of those issues. So expansion of audit scope, maybe one of the reasons for this. I also think our auditors are more experienced in this through the better training and support and monitoring of those type of issues. Also supports the growth of issues being identified through audits.
Right. So additional sectors being covered,
Mm.
as well as going maybe upstream, so additional tiers being covered, and then also expertise of the auditors themselves. And I guess maybe some of the reason could be linked to slightly evolved audit tools or the use of kind of near adjacent tools like worker survey tools. And talking about worker surveys, that's a good connection to the next discussion. Obviously, you led our worker survey team in the past, actually a long time ago, also our supplier engagement team. And during that work, I know you spent a lot of time looking at harassment and the impact of harassment on site. So
Mm.
talk us through what the current landscape looks like for harassment of workers.
Thank you, Kevin. Absolutely. Um, we also see more harassment issues being identified. So the overall risk for harassment and abuse has increased. And this is actually not easy. It doesn't happen naturally. Why? Um, if we look 5 or 10 years ago, we probably did not have any findings related to harassment because audit has its limitation when it comes to identifying harassment related issues. For instance, workers may not feel comfortable to share this type of insights with an auditor who they have never met or who they have only known for a few minutes. And workers will worry about potential retaliation if they share, details with the auditor. And at that time, workers may also not understand what harassment is and what are the different forms of harassment. So because of all that, previously we did not see a lot of harassment findings in audits, but we're seeing more. We have seen some changes. In 2023, we see harassment related violations being identified in over 20 countries. Examples of such violations include verbal abuse, installing security cameras at workers' locker room, and inappropriate security practice, or others like physical abuse or hitting, etc. Um, More than that, in addition to audits, we're also seeing technology play a big part here. Our adverse media screening tool Sentinel uncover harassment issues in 34 countries.
Mm,
For instance, in countries like France or others, where our audits may not have seen similar violations.
mm.
So if you go to the next slide, you will see some of those incidents being reported. And harassment is not just restricted to factories in the supply chain. It's also, in other sectors. We did a study into restaurant sector in 2023, and it shows similar results. We use different methods to see what type of incident out there being reported related to ESG on the internet related to restaurant sector. We retrieved nearly 1,000 incidents in 2023. Number one issue was wages and benefits. Harassment is ranked number 2 with 18% of the hits. And there are another 8% about discrimination. So harassment and discrimination combined is 26%, same as wages and benefits. Number one issue in restaurants sector. And this is not the full picture. If we look at our grievance mechanism data, another tool that we offer, we run worker-centric grievance mechanisms across 10 geographies, covering 2 million workers. And we receive, 3,000, roughly 3,000 calls on a monthly basis. And harassment and abuse is the top 5 issue. Take Bangladesh as example. We received over 1,000 cases in 2023 alone that are related to harassment and abuse in Bangladesh alone, in this one country. And this number has surpassed what we have seen in Sentinel and audits. So this shows when it comes to harassment, no single monitoring mechanism is sufficient on its own. We need different methods to support and supplement each other to provide ongoing and real-time monitoring.
Mm, fascinating. Okay, I have to stop you here. Sorry. Just because I know you've got so much experience identifying these issues and supporting factories and other suppliers to kind of help remediate them. I'm kind of casting your mind back, I guess it must be like 5+ years now. It's very interesting because the first two big kind of thematic areas of child labor and forced labor are definitely areas where a factory would be saving money, right, by using younger workers, cheaper workers, or forcing workers to basically work against their will or do excessive overtime, etc. Whereas it's slightly different with harassment, right? Because I'm sure your data in the past has clearly shown that, there's less productivity when people are harassed. So these two sets of findings kind of go against each other and certainly request quite different sorts of remediation activity. So, how would you say you need to remediate child or forced labor versus harassment?
Excellent question. The root causes can be very, very different. So for instance, forced labor, we need to see what are the indicators, right? What are the underlying drivers? If it's related to foreign migrant workers, then we need to look at the entire hiring process, right? There are a number of high risky areas. For instance, how you manage your labor agents, how labor agents hire workers, because they are the middleman between you and workers. And there can be many of those labor agents in any given country. So remediation will need to be focusing on, looking at the underlying root cause for forced labor based on the specific indicators that has been uncovered. Same for child labor. Well or not they have a age verification procedure, which is a relatively common violation. Well or not they keep records of those, verification results. Well or not, actually related to that, we also capture data on juvenile workers, which are not necessarily child labor, but they're under 18, above the national minimum age for employment. We look at which countries use a lot of juvenile workers, and roughly what percentage of juvenile workers represents out of the overall population. There are certain countries stand out. For instance, Sri Lanka, over 20% of the factories use juvenile workers there. They might be higher risk for child labor and juvenile workers as well. So child labor has a lot to do with the procedures and the hiring difficulties as well. So in a country like China right now, we may see the situation getting slightly better because the availability of workers are there. Harassment, on the other hand, may have a lot to do with the culture
Mm,
with the awareness, whether or not, the supervisors are aware certain things are not okay, whether or not, workers are aware how to protect themselves or how to use the grievance mechanism to voice those concerns, whether or not there are channels for workers to voice those concerns within the facility before the auditors get there, etc. So remediation will need to look at, how we're going to change the behavior and mindset of the workers and management. That will be much longer term.
mm,
So when we do remediation project for harassment, it's not just about training, it's also about continuous engagement with workers, with the middle management, lower management, look at how they're being managed, what kind of incentives they're being given,
mm.
etc. So that we can see if the risk of harassment may go down. But it's actually much harder than other issues.
Yeah, really just kind of reinforces, not just the need for a compliance-oriented approach, but one that's embedded in training, cultural change, continuous assurance, concepts like grievance mechanisms and remediation that really support and are done ideally together with workers so that there's a collective alignment around whether things are actively resolved.
Mm.
Ultimately, all of the above, if they're done effectively, definitely drive not just improvement in terms of working conditions, but can improve productivity, yields, etc., at factories, farms, and in other parts of the supply chain. Yeah, thank you, Daniel. That's fascinating.
Thank
On
you.
to the next topic.
Yes, health and safety.
Mm,
Health and safety. As we know, most of the issues or findings we see in any audits are related to health and safety. In fact, nearly 50% of the violations that we see are related to health and safety. Health and safety is a big topic. Chemical, electricity, electrical building, worker protection, fire prevention, etc. But it doesn't necessarily mean, our workplaces are getting safer. So if we go to the next slides, we can see, audit findings. Nearly 50% of them are related to health and safety. And the number is going up slightly, but pretty stable. Roughly 50% are related to health and safety. Top issues we see: machine guards, PPE, insufficient protection from chemical leakage, so secondary container, occupational health surveillance, regulatory approvals for building safeties, etc. Those are common findings we see globally. What we don't see is incidents. It's very, very rare for us to see incidents or fire incidents, to be more precise, from audits. But we know there are fire incidents every day globally, many of them in factories, workplace. Where are they? We don't see them from audits. We do see them from the internet, from the news reporting. In fact, International Labour Organization has estimated that nearly 3 million people, workers, died due to workplace incidents. That's a very big number. And
What's in 2023?
every year,
Oh my gosh.
3 million. So if we go to the next slide, you will be, actually, go to the next slide. We'll come back to this one. We'll come back to that one. So you can see here on the upper right is the ILO report. So if you're interested, take a look. Nearly 3 million people die of work-related incidents and disease. We don't see those things from audits. Not saying audits is bad, but it may not give us the full picture. We need other tools. So for taking Sentinel as an example, we identified over 300 fire incidents and fatal injuries in 2023 and 2024 alone, across 34 countries, across different sectors. So our impression is right. There are definitely fire incidents and people die from work. And this did not go down because the fire extinguishers were mistakenly placed or not well maintained. Those are related, but we need more tools. We need other tools to support audits, to help us understand the risks related to health and safety in our value chain. Because those are people's life, and that's the most basic human rights. People that are protected from safety hazards, and they're able to go home by the end of the day to spend time with their family. So we need to talk more about health and safety, especially incidents that will lead to, fatal injuries. Great. Very quickly, we would love to do more, but time flies. We also look at, potential differences in terms of audit findings between countries and between sectors. We have some interesting findings, and we do want to elaborate this a little bit more, maybe in a follow-up webinar or white paper. For instance, on the left-hand side, you can see South Korea actually has higher risk for firefighting equipment in comparison with others. And on the right hand, you can see apparel, footwear, and textile has higher risk for machine guards because of the machines they use, obviously. So yeah, we definitely see differences between sector and countries. And it will be great for us to have a follow-up discussion to elaborate this a little bit more.
Super interesting. I'm sure a lot of people are taking screenshots of this slide. And obviously, for those that would like to discuss more, feel free to reach out to Ding Ding and or myself directly afterwards. Very happy to do a follow-up discussion. So thank you, Ding Ding. That's fascinating. Just kind of reflecting on the amount of red and orange in all of those slides certainly shows that the risk landscape is, I think, only getting more and more present and compelling, and that requires a really agile and dynamic program design, especially with access to information, how it is today, and again, with artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, Copilot, even answering a lot of these questions for us these days. It's very important to have ground truth data that supports that day-to-day decision making as a business. So thank you kind of for really showing us what that looks like in practice. Now, talking about data, let's just briefly reflect on the kind of data landscape itself in terms of what data is out there, how reliable it is, and then increasingly, actually the need for business to show data confidence and to provide assurance around the use of data. These are questions that are also very much kind of front and center and build naturally, I think, from what you've just presented before, Ding Ding. Perhaps if I just reflect very briefly on traceability, and you can then take us from traceability to transparency. So if traceability is really looking at multiple different levels within a supply chain and being able to track and trace the flow of a product or multiple different raw materials that go into a product across each of those different levels of a supply chain, here you can see, I guess, an example a lot of people will be increasingly familiar with, one relating to cotton, going from the farmer through to traders, ginners, seed processors, spinners, etc., kind of all the way through to the manufacturing parts from mills, etc., ultimately to retailers, brands, and I guess, to the consumer. Multiple different stages, some of which are increasingly opaque, difficult to track. And this is not just for cotton, of course, as everyone knows, it can apply for multiple different commodity types, many of which are in the agricultural space. So things like palm, for example, or various different seafoods, it's very hard to get all the way down to the source for many of these, particularly for companies that have less vertically integrated supply chains, or for companies that have less leverage in their buying power, so are less able to influence their suppliers at any tier really to disclose information about the sub-suppliers. Now, not just the supply chains themselves being complex, but then also maybe you can just link us through CBP, Customs and Border Protection's requirements around tracing and documentation onto then the question around not just how do we get that information, but then how good is that information, and a quick discussion of transparency.
Absolutely. So traceability is such a buzzword. We hear this almost every day. And I'm sure this is on the minds of our audience right now. Um, this is hard because, we have spent decades working with tier one, and we still face a lot of challenges there. Now the expectation suddenly, it's not just about tier one, but all the way to the beginning. There are technology solutions out there to help us, gather the information. And we're not talking about just the names. If you have a shipment stopped by CBP, you need to, show the supply chain map. You also need to show a series of documents that can demonstrate that this product are made where by whom. And that includes procurement documents, shipping documents, payment, financial documents, invoices, payment records, also production records, warehouse inbound and outbound records, contracts with your suppliers. We're looking at a huge amount of documentation that are scattered. They're not linked up easily because that's not how supply chain works, right? You don't just pay always per that purchase order. You may pay one payment that covers multiple purchase orders, which
Mhm.
covers different supply chain, etc. So traceability, having the right set of documentation per CBP's requirements is a very high bar. We have worked on this in different sectors, not just apparel, but also other sectors like solar, um, medical care products, hard goods, some chemical products as well, and apparel, not just cotton, but other products such as polyester, viscose, and others. The number one takeaway and number one question that I have for customers at the beginning of the project is leverage, because the scope is big. And the amount of work is huge. By the end of the day, it's about leverage because we need the tier one to be accountable to gather a lot of documentation, the ones that we just mentioned, and then organize them in a way that we can, review, validate, audit, and then organize, prepare documentation for CBP's review. So by the end of the day, it will be leverage. And leverage is not something that we always have or have sufficiently across, all of our supply chain. One example is whether or not we're able to use our leverage to gain transparency for ESG risks. And that links to the next slide, transparency. You may have heard about this for a while now. We talk about transparency for the last decades or more. Since I've been here, we categorize a quick reminder. We categorize audits into three status for transparency. Transparent, meaning that we think we have seen the correct records or real records of wages and hours. Inconsistent, we have seen evidences that suggest otherwise. Inconclusive, we smell something is wrong, but we haven't got concrete evidence to raise an inconsistent finding. So that's the three categories that we categorize for every social audits we have. And left hand, you can see the trend for key sourcing countries: China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Indonesia. Overall, the trend is going down, meaning we see more issues with transparency. For instance, Pakistan and India, we see quite a big drop in their transparency. And this is something we have been talking to suppliers, tier one suppliers, for the last decades or two, and we still struggle to get, a higher degree of transparency. China, 55% of audits are considered transparent. That's a little bit over half of all audits we do.
Mm.
This is not going to be sufficient. And if we don't have reliable, transparent records, anything about traceability, any conversation about traceability will be premature, because how are we going to have confidence in all these other documents they will produce, and go, come up with a conclusion, to to submit to CBP. So transparency is really a critical foundation for tracing, and they're closely connected. If the factories are falsifying records for social audits, what do we expect when it comes to traceability? What is our confidence level of the documents that they will produce, and much more documents, many, many more in terms of volume. So it's not too old to talk about transparency, and we need to look at transparency in the lens of traceability and make sure that we don't promote something at the expense of other things that are actually foundation of that.
Can I ask a very quick question here? So looking at the difference, certainly in terms of trending between India and Bangladesh, why do you think the Bangladesh numbers are generally quite good and the Indian numbers have gone down?
Excellent question. Bangladesh work factories, this is a little bit tradition as well. Bangladesh factories generally are okay to pay back workers correctly for their wages. And their working hour limits is not very strict as well. So historically, Bangladesh factories are generally okay for transparency because the motivation to falsify is not as high as other countries.
Got it. Super interesting. I was hoping that there might also be some positive benefits here relating to really the Alliance, the Cord, Neropon, and all of the work that's been done there, trying to drive and build deeper levels of engagement and trust with factories. So whether there is or isn't, I'm going to just keep that to myself and like to think that there's some overflow benefit there as well, in addition to what you've just outlined, which makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about confidence.
Let's talk about confidence. So transparency and confidence. Here we look at the audit results from the lens of the standards. So by standards, we mean the audit checklist, the protocol, the number of staff days, sampling approach, audit approach, etc. So we compared the audit results between a number of standards. 5 of them. One is the client's own standards. So the standards that are developed and maintained by customers. So we still have, some customers do that today. And it will be combined of all those programs. That will be the orange line. Second is ERSA, which is legacy elevates responsible sourcing business.
Let's call it the elevated
responsible sourcing assessments.
Yeah.
Yes. And then against other 3 industry standards. And you can see, we do see differences in terms of number 1, number of findings we see per audit. So average number of findings per audit. Number 2, percentage of audits with critical or zero tolerance findings. So whether or not audits are giving us more severe violations. Number 3, audits are critical findings related to transparency, i.e. inconsistent records. And you can see that some industry standards don't perform as well as ERSA or customer standards. This may have something to do with, number of staff days allocated. Do auditors have sufficient time? Number 2, whether or not we have the right tool to start with. Audit checklist, if it's too long, auditors will spend time ticking the boxes. If it's too short, we're largely dependent on auditors' experience and personal judgment because they don't have enough guidance to look through from the checklist. Sample size too small, then we're not necessarily getting, real insight. Too big, quantity may take over the quality. So standards audit protocol does seem to matter, and we welcome feedback and would love to discuss this further, because this is something that we should discuss a lot more openly to see what is the right protocol and program. As we have seen, has discussed during today's sharing, audit is critical. Even though it has challenges, we still need audit to perform better, and so that we can continue to service issues like harassment, child labor, and forced labor, and others. But it's time for us to review whether or not we have the right protocol, whether or not it's fit for purpose for today's supply chain issues. As an anecdote, we actually get a lot more client requests recent years to review their tools and checklist to see, if what they have built 10 years ago is still relevant, and how can that be benchmarked against, other standards and tools. So want to share this as well. And, the key takeaway here is it's time for us to review and rethink what we have, and ask ourselves if we have the right tool and protocol to monitor our supply chain and value chain.
Absolutely, Ding Ding. I think that's super clear, both really in part two, where you so clearly showed just so many risks out there that still need to be managed, even though people have been doing this for 20 to 30 years. There's still a lot of risks out there. The underlying risk landscape is still changing quickly, and technology is still giving us more insight into risk and more visibility of risk than ever before. And then in this part three, really your sort of breakdown of the concepts of transparency and how, even though it's critical, it doesn't work without your breakdown of traceability, and how, even though that's critical, it doesn't work without transparency, not just at the level of the audit, but transparency also applies through any other kind of data collection mechanism, whether it's a self-assessment questionnaire or a worker survey. If you're not getting it through an audit, you may not be getting it through one of those other means. And it's very likely that actually suppliers may just give you what they think you want, rather than necessarily what you really need, which is real fact-based and transparent information. And then confidence in the programs and tools that you're using as part of this whole process, right, of managing those risks in your supply chain. We spoke a lot about how relevant all of this is from a social perspective, and how relevant it all is in terms of data and being able to surface data that one can use, whether you're reporting internally, whether you're reporting to a regulator or a stock exchange. But it also applies for social as well as environmental issues. And here, we didn't talk a lot about environment. We're not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but I wanted to just show a couple of screenshots from a news outlet that I think you all know, because it's so present, this narrative in the day-to-day media, which is the narrative around data, the narrative around information that we're using when we make assertions around ESG generally. So Ding Ding, you outlined what the risks are. You showed what sort of tools, whether it's traceability, transparency, or other audit tools, etc., that are critical in surfacing ESG data and managing it, then reporting on it, right? Once you do start reporting on it, whether it's social or environmental, there are questions increasingly around how good that data is. So it's never been more critical than ever before to actually do everything you've just said really well, with a high degree of rigor, high degree of confidence, using tools that you know and trust, and actually following a strict and robust process of assurance. Increasingly, some of the big questions and assertions that have been made by businesses on both social and environmental issues are being called into question. We are at a sea change in ESG, where it's no longer acceptable to just say, this is the data we've collected, but that data needs to be assured and verified, right? It needs to be shown as being accurate and correct, leveraging insights that come from the ground and that come from third-party assurance bodies. Now, we've taken this very much on board ourselves with one specific area, in addition to everything we've just discussed on the social side. When it comes to environment, likewise, we've seen from a number of our clients that there are a lot of concerns around the confidence levels of scope 3 data. So much scope 3 data historically was estimated, and some of those news headlines that I've just shown on the previous slide are calling into question how good that data is, whether it's scope 3 or whether it's related to carbon offsets. Estimating that kind of information is no longer good enough either. It needs to be based on real ground truth insights. So not only have we launched a carbon module within EIQ for corporates, but we will also be opening up a carbon module directly for factories and farms to track and trace the carbon associated with their own operations. And we've also added a number of new elements into our existing toolkit to support the better collection of energy and greenhouse gas data. So that includes both the supplemental data sheet that now does that as standard for ideally every one of the 25,000 audits we're doing, as well as additional bespoke and really focused self-assessment questionnaires and audit tools on greenhouse gases and energy, and even actually specific improvement tools and projects. So I wonder if you wanted to comment on this briefly, Ding Ding, as a kind of final thought before we close for the day.
No, I think you covered everything, Kevin.
Great. I think it just really puts very sharply into focus how critical it is to have good, robust, clear, and assured data, as increasingly regulators and financial organizations are leveraging and using this to make decisions about products. And therefore, increasingly, it's having not just compliance impacts, but also direct financial impacts for businesses directly, as well as those factories, farms, and other agents within their supply chains. So I'm sure you have found this conversation just as compelling as me, and hopefully you've had at least part of your appetite satiated. The conversation, though, does not need to stop here. For those of you that would like to have a follow-up conversation, feel free to actually download the white paper on our supply chain ESG Global Risk Outlook. This will be forthcoming over the next few days. So if you would like to know where it is, definitely follow LRQA and EIQ on all the usual places, LinkedIn, our website, etc. And we'll make sure that you get early access to that report when it's available. So the download PDF of everything we've discussed is available for you shortly. Secondly, if you'd like to get more information about EIQ, which is the tool that we've used to really inform so much of the insight that's gone into this presentation, feel free to also check us out at eiq.ai. So follow-ups, go to LRQA or EIQ websites accordingly. And just one last comment. Again, I'd really like to say thank you to Ding Ding and the team for all of the hard work you put into this session. It's been super interesting. Definitely, I've learned a huge amount during this process, and I hope you've gotten something out of it as well. Thank you so much, Ding Ding. Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone, for
Kevin.
joining.